Hey there, welcome into Unpaid Interns. It is Wednesday, December 23rd, and the NBA season in this unusual schedule just started yesterday. So we're going to talk a little bit of hoops today. And we have Ben Ladner. He's an NBA writer, previously with Sports Illustrated Atlanta, and now covers the NBA for Fansided. Ben, I really appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, the season just kicked off last night, a couple games. We got a full slate of action later this evening. Obviously, a very unique season, a late start, different schedules, and it's weird because the season just ended in October, a little over 2 months ago. What are your expectations, and what are you excited about for what's going to be a very unusual season? Of course, also being primarily played without fans as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, my hope is that we get through the season okay and everything kind of works out. Obviously, there are a lot of kind of reasons to be concerned. One big one in particular with COVID-19, you just hope that that isn't too much of an issue. Obviously, it'll kind of loom and be present over the entire season, but you hope that it doesn't cause any kind of catastrophe. But beyond that, I think just kind of the uncertainty this year, particularly in the Eastern Conference, but really across the league. I think there's a lot of depth at the top of both conferences. I think, like most people, I would consider the Lakers probably the preseason favorite at this point, but I don't think it's like fait accompli that they're going to be the eventual NBA champion. So I think just having so many stars coming back from injury and returning to the court, having new faces on new teams, and just having a lot of depth in kind of that championship picture, I think could be really exciting. Like, there are teams that could finish fourth, fifth, sixth in either conference and potentially make a run at the conference finals or even the finals, which is pretty exciting and should make for a really fascinating kind of playoff mix. But beyond that, just seeing kind of all these teams in action, I like to follow the entire league. Like I mentioned, a lot of guys have changed teams, changed uniforms this offseason. So I think just keeping track of that, kind of diving in, figuring out, getting a feel for each team is always really exciting. Usually in October, but I guess now in December, this time of year is just kind of a good time to kind of get a feel for each team and have an idea of kind of what to expect for the rest of the season.
One of the teams that I find most interesting, and I think many people do, are the Brooklyn Nets, who got to debut last night finally with their full a plethora of stars led by Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. And one of the big questions people have is there going to be a lot of drama in that locker room, or is it going to lead to success? We've seen both with stars coming together with different teams. How do you see that playing out, especially they had an interesting head coaching addition as well with Steve Nash this year?
Yeah, and sometimes it's kind of unclear who the head coach is, right? Like Kyrie Irving made that comment of, well, some days it's going to be me, other days it might be KD. And then Steve Nash is kind of sitting there like, well, where am I in all of this? And then with Mike D'Antoni, Jacques Vaughn on the bench as well, they have a really deep staff and a really deep team. And you sort of asked whether it's going to be drama, whether it's going to be success. I think it could be both. Like I think we've seen teams where, I mean, Kyrie Irving is a good example on those Cleveland teams where there's a lot of drama. There's a lot of stuff that kind of makes you scratch your head and worry about the team. And then they make the NBA finals and they look really good. And sometimes it just doesn't matter if the talent on the court is at a certain level. Maybe the chemistry, the fit concerns, all of that don't really matter. The one big issue I do think Brooklyn has is just their defense in general. Like, I'm not sure they have an above average defender in their starting lineup, which obviously is a challenge when you're talking about a team that is hoping, I should say, to win a championship and be in that mix. So that's a concern. They could still make a trade. Obviously, James Harden has been the name talked about and linked to Brooklyn, but they could trade for a less talented player that kind of addresses some of those defensive weaknesses that they're going to have. But man, offensively, if Kevin Durant is Kevin Durant, like he looked like on Tuesday night and throughout the preseason, if he really is that guy again, and if Kyrie Irving is going to have a career best season like he looked like he would in 2020, this is going to be a really, really devastating offense, not to mention guys like Spencer Dinwiddie, Joe Harris, kind of these secondary complementary weapons that they have, who are more than capable of either hitting shots, creating for others. They just have a lot of different sources of offense. And two of those sources are just elite shot creators and elite shot makers, even among the highest level creators in the NBA, in Kyrie and Kevin Durant. So it's going to be a really fun team to watch. It's going to be a really fascinating arc to track throughout the season. And I think offensively, there might not be a team better this season, either by points per possession or just by kind of high-end ceiling than the Brooklyn Nets.
Another fun team to watch, a little bit younger, but the team that you've primarily covered, the Atlanta Hawks, led by Trae Young, one of the more exciting superstars in the league. I know you got lots of intel on them. And I guess the big question is this year, can that youth translate to the postseason? What are you looking for this season for the Hawks, and what should people know about this team?
I think the one thing that's being overlooked with this team is just how big of a talent upgrade they made in the offseason. I mean, I covered last year's team. I was probably a year early on that beat, but I covered them when they were starting Damian Jones and Jabari Parker as their starting center and power forward. Clint Capella and John Collins or Danilo Gallinari or whoever you consider in that role, those guys are not Damian Jones and Jabari Parker. I mean, they really upgraded this roster kind of from top to bottom. Like Trae Young should be better because he's entering year 3, although it'll be hard for him to be better than he was last year. The rest of their young guys are, maybe they won't take like massive leaps like Trae did last year, but they're going to make progress, you would assume, given that they're where they are on the aging curve and just in their skill development. And then they added 2 guys, I think, in Danilo Gallinari and Bogdan Bogdanovic, who aren't like all-star level players, but they're certainly high-end NBA players for the roles they're going to be asked to play. Like Bogdan Bogdanovic is one of the better complementary playmakers that you're going to find in that price range, that $17 to $20 million a year range. And he's going to be, he should slot fairly cleanly into that starting lineup. Gallinari, especially if he's coming off the bench as just a floor spacer, shot maker, creator. He's a guy that can get his own shot, who can space the floor around Trae Young, who can just do a lot of really good things for this offense. So I think for the roles that those guys are going to be playing, they're probably near the high end of what you would realistically hope to have in those roles across the NBA. So I think this team's talent is maybe being slept on just a little bit. And I understand it because they were, arguably the worst team in the league last year. It's really hard to make the jump from 20 wins to, 41, 42, whatever they're hoping to win this, whatever range you kind of want to put them in this season. Like, that's a big jump to make. And it's not often that a team can make that jump. But I do think that we're looking at a little bit of a different team just from a talent perspective this year. It's a lot deeper. It's a lot more talented. And I think it's just a lot more complete than it was last year. That said, there are certainly concerns about the defense. There are concerns about how these pieces might fit together. There are valid concerns about whether there are too many mouths to feed on that offense, because they do have kind of the downside of having a lot of options is having a lot of guys who expect to be primary options or prominent options. Those are all going to be things they have to sort out. But right now, I would handicap them as the favorites to get the 8 seed, at least going into the play-in tournament. Who knows how that itself is going to shake out. But I could see them getting as high as 7, maybe 6 if something just goes catastrophically wrong for one of those top 6 teams in the East. But right now, I would say they are solidly the 8th best team in the Eastern Conference, with a little bit of upside and probably a little bit more downside.
High expectations for certain for Atlanta. Now, you mentioned earlier the Lakers probably the favorites for most people in the NBA. Who's the team that you feel like is the biggest threats to take down the defending champions?
I think it still has to be the Clippers, with all due respect to the Nuggets, who made the conference finals last year, the Jazz, the Mavericks, the Trailblazers, if you consider them in that mix. Like, there are a lot of good teams in the West. I still think it's the Clippers. They just have the most top-end talent. I think they have the most, maybe not the most depth because Utah is pretty deep, but they have a complete team. I'm not worried about their depth. I don't worry about the fit necessarily of how their pieces go together. And Kawhi Leonard is one of the best playoff players in NBA history. And I don't think that's an overstatement, given what he's accomplished, both in San Antonio and in Toronto. And even last year, putting Game 7 of the Nuggets series aside, he was really good in the playoffs. And then Paul George, I think, is a better player than he showed, although he certainly has a habit of kind of putting his foot in his mouth and not necessarily endearing himself to people. But the talent on that team is really, really good. I think there were some extenuating circumstances last year that held them back and caused them to lose that Nuggets series that maybe won't be present this year. With full credit to the Nuggets, I do think that some of the factors that caused that outcome to be what it was won't necessarily come into play this year. And when you're projecting out, especially this far away from the playoffs, when we don't have any data on any of these teams, I think you just have to go with the most talented team. But one team I will throw in the mix here is Utah. I think they're really deep. I think they could maybe be the best two-way team in the NBA this year, just because they have Rudy Gobert, an all-world defensive pillar. They brought back Derek Favors, who is a pretty good defensive center in his own right. And they just have so many weapons offensively, so many guys who can create, so many guys who can shoot, almost like the souped up Hawks in some ways on offense without quite that same primary catalyst. But just the amount of different avenues they have to score, the amount of threats they can put on the floor, the lack of weak links in their rotation, at least in the regular season, I think they might be the biggest threat to usurp the Lakers in the standings and finish with the 1 seed. But in the playoffs, I would still have to go with the Clippers just because of the way their roster construction kind of lends itself to how playoff basketball is played. I think they have to be considered the kind of the runner-up or the kind of team in waiting if the Lakers take that step back.
All right, you're talking about a lot of teams in the West with threats to the Lakers. Now in the East, we've mentioned the Nets. The Bucks have come in the last couple seasons as the favorite. They haven't been able to make it over the hump. Are they your favorite, I guess, in the East this year? And what do they need to do to finally get to the NBA Finals, as they've been the 1 seed the last 2 seasons?
Yeah, every time I look at that top 6 in the East, Milwaukee, Boston, Toronto, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and Miami, I kind of just throw my hands up. I don't really know how to order those teams. I would be surprised if Milwaukee doesn't finish with the 1 seed, but I'm not sure that I would peg them as the favorite in the playoffs because of the limitations we've seen the last couple of years. Now, they were really close in 2019 to making the finals. You know, if the wind blows in the other direction, like 1 or 2 miles per hour, that series might tilt toward Milwaukee. Like it really was that close because they were up, 2-0 with a huge second half lead. And then the momentum swings entirely back to Toronto. So I do think that the Bucks have the potential to do it in the playoffs. I don't think that they're chokers. I don't think that they're like destined to lose in the second round every year like they have the last 2 years. I think they do have real playoff upside, but I'm not sure that they can access that upside as readily as some of these other teams because they don't have quite the scheme versatility and the adaptability of like a Miami or a Toronto or a Boston. That said, Brooklyn is always kind of lurking there. It wouldn't surprise me if they made the finals. Philadelphia, with kind of this new look around Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, their roster actually makes sense this year for the first time in a couple of years, which is always a good thing when you have 2 just uber talented top-end players. So it's just, I really think you could make the case for any of those 6 teams as the favorite to make the NBA Finals right now, especially if Boston's healthy. Like if Kemba Walker is Kemba Walker, you add in Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, Boston looks like the favorite. If Miami's going to catch lightning in a bottle in the postseason like they did last year, you might have to say Miami's the favorite. So you can make the case for all of these teams. And I think you can also pick nits with all of these teams and say maybe, they have these 1 or 2 weaknesses that you don't feel great about in a playoff series. And that might cause them to fall below a team like Milwaukee, a team like Brooklyn, if you believe in their upside. I would probably put Toronto near the bottom of that group just because they struggled with creation and just playmaking and dynamism in last year's playoffs. And I don't think they necessarily got any better in that regard over the offseason. So I don't believe in them quite as much in the postseason, but those other 5, I think might have equally high playoff ceilings. We just have to kind of see how the season shakes out. Once we kind of get more information and get a better sense of these teams, maybe I'll be able to make a better prognostication. But as for now, it's really hard for me to kind of discern who among that group of 6 has really separated themselves. The one thing I will say is I would probably pick whoever comes out of the West to beat whoever comes out of the East in the NBA Finals.
Now, one of the great things of the NBA is the offseason can be as entertaining as the regular season. Always tons of storylines and drama. And maybe the biggest saga this offseason has been James Harden, the Houston Rockets. I've seen players traded away from there. He's demanding a trade now. There's been COVID-19 issues with him showing up to training camp late. And just today, now doubt about if he's going to even play in the regular season opener with some COVID-19 issues as well. I guess, do you see him getting traded, and what target would maybe make the most sense and be the best fit for him?
I think at some point he has to be traded. It's just, I know he has 2 years left on his deal, so theoretically the Rockets could keep him around for all of that and still be a competitive team. But if he's going to act the way that he's acted so far and just express such clear discontent with that situation, it just doesn't make sense to keep him around, even if you do believe in what you have with him on the team. That just feels like it's going to become untenable at some point. I have believed kind of all along that the Rockets are going to take this into the season, maybe even up to the trade deadline, and that thinking I think still holds at this point because their season kicks off tonight, and James Harden's still on the team, so he's still going to be really good as long as he's on the floor. I mean, he's James Harden, and that team is going to be competitive as long as they have him. He's kind of a walking like top 8 offense and playoff berth unto himself. So, certainly you can understand the reluctance to give him up because he's really good. It's likely that you'll never get a player as good as James Harden in whatever trade package you get for James Harden. But if he's just going to totally wreck your locker room, as he seems like he's done so far, and ignore the NBA safety protocols and all of that and just act out like he has, like, I don't know, is it worth it to keep a guy like that on the team if your championship upside isn't really there? Like, I don't think it is for the Rockets. So certainly at some point, I think this has to come to a head. I think he has to be traded. But I actually don't know that his trade value is going to be as high as some might think it is. And especially when you look at like what the Pacers got for Paul George, that ended up working out for them in hindsight, but what the Thunder got for Paul George, like, I don't think it's going to be that level of return. Like, I think it'll be closer to a Kawhi Leonard from San Antonio to Toronto, that kind of trade. I think it'll be closer to that level of return for Houston than it will be to like, the absolute haul that the Pelicans got for Anthony Davis, or that the Thunder got for Paul George or something like that. So, and honestly, I think the longer that the Rockets hold on to Harden, the lower his trade value becomes. So if it were me, I would try to get off of him as soon as I could. But again, the interest around the league might not be as high as Houston hoped that it would be. And that might kind of be the source of stagnation here, where they're expecting, this is James Harden. We should get a blue chip prospect and draft picks in return for him. And other teams are kind of blanching at that and saying, we kind of like where we are. Because the thing is, if you trade for James Harden, you are probably doing so to put yourself to go from very good team to clear championship contender. And a lot of teams on that precipice don't necessarily stand to benefit a ton from adding James Harden because they're already so close to contending for a championship. So how much does he really move the needle for a team like Boston, let's say, if they give up a Jaylen Brown, just as a hypothetical? And then the other thing is that if you trade for Harden, you still need to have players for Harden to play with once he gets there. So how much are you willing to give up if kind of the aggregate return is going to be, putting you about where you were before you traded for Harden, because you're giving up talent and assets and all of that to make the deal work. So I just think the mechanics and the logistics of this are a little harder than they might seem on the surface. And for that reason, I think that's caused the market to cool a little bit, and it's made it a little harder for Houston to find a deal that they really feel good about.
Certainly a very interesting situation going forward, something to watch. Now, last season, the Miami Heat were certainly the breakout team of the NBA, an unexpected run to the NBA Finals. There always seems like there's that one team that comes out of nowhere, has a lot of success, makes a run in the playoffs. Who do you think maybe fans should keep their eye on and might be this year's breakout NBA team?
That's a tough question. I kind of mentioned all those top 6 in the East. I don't think it'd be a surprise necessarily for any of those teams. Denver would be a good candidate here, but they kind of did that last year. So I don't know how much they're catching the rest of the league off guard there. The 2 teams I'll go with, I'll expand it to 3, all 3 in the West: Portland, Dallas, and Utah. I mentioned Utah before. I'm really high on them in the regular season. We'll see in the playoffs. They could be kind of Miami-esque team, catch lightning in a bottle, have Donovan Mitchell just explode for a month and a half, 2 months, and take them to the conference finals or finals. Dallas obviously has Luka Doncic, who a lot of people are considering the MVP favorite headed into the year. If he takes another step, improves the three-point shooting, and things kind of coalesce around him, Kristaps Porzingis gets healthy, all of that, things go right for them. I could see them, knocking off a team like the Clippers in the first or second round, if that matchup kind of comes to pass. And then Portland, they just kind of feel like this team every year, where they have Dame Lillard. They're going to have a really explosive offense. If things break right in the front court and their defense gets together and they can get into kind of the top half of the league on defense, they have upset potential in the first round of the playoffs. We saw them do it a few years ago when they made it to the conference finals as a 3 seed in those 2019 playoffs. Like, they have that playoff upside because of Dame Lillard and CJ McCollum, whose games I think translate really, really well in a postseason environment. It's just a matter of whether they have the defensive integrity, whether they have enough kind of ancillary options to get them through the regular season, and maybe someone to step up in the playoffs, like a Gary Trent, someone like that who did it last year. So they have that in them. I would say it's less likely that they're that team than Utah or Dallas. But certainly, I think any of those teams in that like 3 to 6 range in the West, your Denvers, your Utahs, your Dallases, Portland, maybe Golden State, although they didn't look great on opening night. I think any of those teams could get in that mix. One of them, I think, is bound to have a surprising postseason. It's just hard to know exactly who that's going to be at this point.
Now, kind of piggybacking off that question, in terms of players, we've seen a couple players really just burst on the scene and go from no names to superstars. You mentioned Trae Young. Obviously, Luka Doncic had a breakout season last year as well. What's a name that maybe people aren't talking about, or maybe a younger player that you think will really burst on this scene this year and maybe become an all-star and a household name?
That's a tough question, because I think there are a lot of guys who were kind of right below that all-star mix last year who will get in this year, especially in the West, who won't necessarily be like surprise players or breakout players. It'll just be guys we already knew were good who are now going to get all-star spots because they take a step forward. But there are a couple guys, one in the West, one in the East. I'll start with the East because it's an Indiana guy, and that's OG Anunoby. Mm-hmm. I would not pick him to make an all-star team this year, but it also wouldn't surprise me if he did. He's already one of the best defenders in the NBA, especially on the ball. And if he has, if he's able to kind of dial up his usage and his creation and polish his offensive game a little bit, that might change the way we talk about Toronto when it comes to their playoff upside and when it comes to what they can do in the regular season. And certainly when it comes to Anunoby's own upside and the player he could be. So I think he has that in him. The Kawhi comparisons have been made. I wouldn't go nearly that far, but he could become a fringe all-star, a sub all-star type of guy, like high-end starter on a really good team. If that's his destiny, like that's a really good outcome for him and for Toronto. And then in the West, I would look at a guy maybe like Jaren Jackson for the Grizzlies, who I think is really going to sway whether we talk about Memphis in that, it's like, let's say 7 to 10 mix in that play-in conversation, or whether they're just a little bit below that. If he's the defensive force that a lot of people thought he could be out of college, if he's that floor spacing big that he's already proven to be at the NBA level, and if he really rounds out both of those elements in his game, Memphis might be the favorite to get the 8 seed in the West. If he's not, if he stays injured, if he can't really get healthy and be on the court, if his 3-point shooting regresses, if he doesn't really take that step on defense, I think Memphis is a nice team who has to wait another year to really reach their playoff goals. So he's going to be, we know Ja Morant's going to be really good. Right? We know they have depth. We know they have intriguing young players. We know they have, different ways to score and a good coach and all of that. We know a lot about Memphis. I think the one thing that we don't know is whether Jaren Jackson is going to be a star or whether he's going to be a solid starter. And that difference could ultimately kind of make or break Memphis's playoff hopes.
Gonna have you make a few predictions here. One, I guess your 2 teams in the NBA Finals. Who do you think is going to win it, and also an NBA MVP as well?
I'll start with MVP because I think it's a little easier, although I do think there are a lot of candidates. I think, so if I'm projecting who I expect to think will be worthy of the award, right? Not who is going to win it, but who I expect to think is deserving of it, I would probably go with Giannis. Again, he would be the first 3-time or back-to-back-to-back MVP, I think, since Larry Bird in the 80s, which is a pretty remarkable accomplishment. I don't expect him to actually win the award. I think Luka Doncic is going to probably receive more votes. I think there are actually several guys who could get more votes. But I would expect Giannis to be the best, most valuable regular season player this year once again. I'd probably put Luka right behind him at number 2 with Nikola Jokic of the Nuggets rounding out the top 3. And then as far as the playoffs, I would probably pick the Lakers to come out of the West. I think they have to be the favorite at this point. I mentioned the Clippers. They have some upside. They're not far behind to me, but I still like the Lakers' top end talent. I still like just the entire mix of their roster a little bit better. And then, like I said, the East is just really, really difficult to peg. I think Brooklyn probably has the highest upside. Like, obviously, if they look like they looked on opening night, they should be the favorite. But I'm not sure they're going to look like that all season. If KD and Kyrie are healthy, if I knew they were going to be healthy, if I knew they were going to be themselves for a full season, I would probably pick Brooklyn, even if I have questions about their defense. But ultimately, those defensive questions, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, as you can probably tell. But I just have too many questions about Brooklyn to pick them. Oh, man, I want to pick Philadelphia, but I don't trust them. I don't think Miami is quite the team that we saw in the bubble. I have questions about Milwaukee. Boston may not be healthy or deep enough. Toronto, I'll go with Milwaukee. I don't feel great about that prediction, but I think they're probably the most likely. If you gave me Milwaukee or the field, I would definitely take the field. But if I had to pick a single team, I would probably stay with the Bucks. But I really don't feel great about that pick. And again, whoever comes out of the West, I think has to be the clear favorite in the NBA Finals, unless something just drastically changes over the course of the regular season with one of these East teams.
The Eastern Conference especially going to be fun to watch and fun playoffs as well. Before I let you go, Ben, wanted to just ask you a couple questions about your career. Know you're an IU alum, and know it's been tough for many people, in the sports media industry since the COVID-19 pandemic. What I guess what's your career path been like since you graduated from IU, and what's been the challenges for you in the last 8 or so months since March and the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I got pretty lucky coming right out of college. I got on with SI as the Hawks beat writer, I think in like October of 2019. So that was a really good place to fall, right out of college on an NBA beat, especially on a market that isn't super heavily covered. So there was kind of an avenue to become one of the 4 or 5 most prominent beat writers on that. Not that I'm a prominent beat writer in general, but just to be kind of one of the main people on the beat in a market like that for an NBA team is a pretty fortunate circumstance that, I was super lucky to have fallen into. Shout out to Matt Dollinger for helping make that happen, another IU alum. And then since then, I left SI kind of right as things, or the season, I should say, went to smoke right as things were going sideways. And then I left SI, in the middle of in the middle of the summer when things were really out of control. So really, like, I've kind of just been in a holding pattern for the last few months, almost by necessity, because, the plan had kind of been to, find a new thing once the season ends, figure that out after the end of the NBA season in April. But there was no end of the NBA season for the Hawks, at least, because their season just got cut short as it was. So I guess mine kind of did too. So it was kind of right as I was planning on figuring out the next step. Okay, where am I going to go from here? Am I going to continue with this, do something else? Right as I was starting to kind of figure that out, everything kind of got shut down, and the decision was kind of made for me. So hopefully, things will pick back up here in the not too distant future. We'll see what the 2021 NBA season holds. But yeah, I was really lucky right out of college just to land where I did, and hopefully that'll translate to something bigger and brighter in the future.
I don't think I've gone a single podcast since October and haven't mentioned IU football. So since you're an IU alum, I've got to get your thoughts. I know you're a basketball guy, but I guess you were here for the very start of the Tom Allen era.
Mm-hmm.
So
the only season I covered that team, I think, was his first year.
Okay. Well, just curious to get your thoughts on the transformation of IU football from a bottom feeder in the Big Ten to right now the number 7 team in the AP poll in the country.
Yeah, well, I remember when I was on that beat, I used to write my stories at halftime. When Indiana had like a 20-point lead, I would, write the lead. Indiana had another big lead and let it slip today. And sure enough, I wouldn't touch it all second half, and that exact scenario would come to pass, and they would blow the lead and let it go. So it was very jarring to watch them this year and see them actually beat some of these teams that they had continually fallen short against and continually blown leads against. I guess Ohio State notwithstanding, but it was just a more kind of reliable, trustworthy, solid team. Like, you felt like when Indiana got a lead, they weren't going to let it slip. And especially as an Atlanta Falcons fan, I'm very scarred by watching football teams give away massive leads in the second half. So that was a pleasant surprise that they were able to kind of make that correction. Obviously, the loss of Penix was kind of devastating midway through that season. I wonder if that played into them getting hosed a little bit in the bowl situations where maybe they were looked at as a team that was a little weaker than their record indicated because they were missing one of the guys that was such an important driver of their success. Although, obviously Tuttle kind of was able to keep the rhythm, keep the beat moving with that team when he stepped in. But yeah, it was just a very pleasant surprise, and almost like the Hawks, where the year after, or a year or two after I leave, they kind of make the step, and so I've missed out now on this team going from bad to good, or bad to mediocre, or whatever it is. But one of these days, I guess I'll latch on to a team that actually is good while I'm there.
I hope so. You're still young, so plenty of years ahead. And you mentioned you were able to spend the last year with the Hawks as a young reporter getting to cover an NBA team. What's maybe a memory or a story that stands out from that time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are two, and they're probably the two that everyone would think of. I mean, I'll say in general, it was cool to kind of be in the thick of it, and that was the people on that beat were very accommodating, very welcoming. It would be easy for people to look at a young reporter and say, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I'm going to step all over him. He's toast. He can't hack it. But everyone on that beat was super nice, super encouraging, super helpful. And so I really appreciated that as just a young reporter, having people to kind of lean on when I needed help, who were working at competitors at different outlets, but were still willing to be helpful, still willing to be encouraging, and collaborative. That was really appreciated. I'll say, like, you talk about the rookie wall a lot in the NBA, and how rookies kind of hit that point midway through the season. Same is true for reporters. I definitely hit that point, around February-ish, where it was just like, man, another one of these games. Sure are a lot of these, but certainly I'm not complaining about being able to cover an NBA team and NBA season. The two things that kind of stand out, obviously the day Kobe Bryant died is just like, I'll never forget that day. Like I can still play back almost every single second of that day from like noon until 11:30 at night. Just in my brain, I can go back and see every single scene that I kind of went through that whole day. I'll never forget watching a Hawks assistant coach who I'd seen at practice, seen before games. He warms up the players. He is a player development guy. So he's in basketball clothes often. And every single day, every time I ever saw him, he was wearing Kobe's. He was wearing the Kobe shoes. And I'll never forget on that day watching him just standing at the elbow before anyone come out to warm up, empty arena. I was just sitting on the sideline watching him, again, wearing Kobe lows, just shooting jumpers from the elbow with the absolute most crestfallen look on his face that I have maybe ever seen. And you could just tell for everyone how much that broke people. And just honestly, for me, obviously, I was devastated that of the news itself, but the more moving thing for me, even more so than the death of an icon and his daughter and the other people in the helicopter, was just seeing the outpouring from the rest of the NBA, seeing how much this had affected everyone else, and kind of sharing that grief with so many other people was a really, really powerful thing to kind of be close to, and obviously the 8-second violation at the start of the game, I cheered up a little bit on press row with that. It was just a really unforgettable day in kind of the worst way. And then the other is March 11th, when Rudy Gobert tested positive for coronavirus. Games got shut down. The season was postponed. We entered this hiatus. I'll never forget just being on press row, looking around at the other beat reporters, like, what is happening? We were trying to follow along on Twitter at what was unfolding in Oklahoma City with the Jazz and the Thunder, while also trying to track this double overtime game between the Hawks and the Knicks, which I still couldn't tell you how it ended. I at that point, I had just kind of lost the ability to pay attention to what was happening in front of me, and was trying to keep track of what was going on with the Gobert situation and the COVID situation, because we'd been tracking it for a while, because we were all kind of wondering, is this going to affect the NBA season? Like, what, we weren't allowed to go into locker rooms at that point. So all the beat reporters, we had all written about COVID. We had all, been up to date on the protocols that the league was taking and everything. But the moment when it actually shut down, there was actually a positive test. that was like a really surreal experience. And I think, when you look back on it, that was kind of the flashpoint moment for the entire nation. Like, that was one of the things I think that made it clear to people, like, oh, this is really something we need to be taking seriously. This could be around to stay. Like, this could really be a problem. And sure enough, all of that was true. But those two moments, like, it was just, for a rookie beat reporter, like, for those two things to happen in the same year, was like, those are two of the most surreal experiences in my life that I'll probably never forget.
Yeah, that certainly memorable experiences. Unfortunately, maybe not the most fun memories you're gonna ever have, especially.
Definitely not.
Yeah, especially as a rookie reporter. Just on that Hawks Knicks game, if my memory serves me correct, Vince Carter hit a late shot there, and that was his final bucket of his career, I think.
He did. Yeah. That was like one of the few plays that I remember from that game, because I was already like walking down to the press room by that point. So.
Well, Ben, we really appreciate you coming on today. It was great to get your NBA insight. It's going to be a really exciting season, and I'm only more excited hearing all the storylines from you.
Yeah, thanks, Griffin. I appreciate you having me on, and glad to see people younger than myself in the shoes that I used to be in, continuing to do this and do it even better than I and my classmates did back when we were at IU. So, congrats to you and all of the current students. I know Galen is still doing a fantastic job over there, and it's good to see what you guys are doing. So keep doing it.
I appreciate that. That will do it today for our episode of Unpaid Interns. We will be off on Friday for the holidays, but we are going to be back on Monday getting you ready for Indiana's game in Tampa in the Outback Bowl against Ole Miss. We're going to have some exciting guests on for that. Until then, for Ben Ladner, I'm Griffin Epstein. We will talk to you again on Monday.